And we're going to somewhere else where violence is maybe something of a daily basis. Unrest is still filling the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, with the continued protest marking 1 year since the death of unarmed black man, teen Michael Brown. With a state of emergency in place, overnight police clashed with demonstrators, with several arrests made. Ori Shapira has the story.
Another night of unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, following exchanges of fire that left one man in critical condition. And a year after the death of African-American teen Michael Brown by a police officer who never faced criminal charges. Earlier Monday, authorities declared a state of emergency in the city.
I strongly condemn the violence that was perpetrated against the community, including the police officers in Ferguson last evening.
But protests continued overnight. At least 23 people were arrested. But the tension and outrage was extended beyond the police force. Some half a dozen residents, all white men who called themselves Oath Keepers, were seen walking around the streets carrying automatic rifles. They claimed to be there to protect a media organization, but their presence raised the anger of African-American residents in town.
You and people who look like you, white males, have the sovereignty to take advantage of the Second Amendment and walk around with assault rifles, but we can't even stand out here and assemble peacefully and exercise our constitutional right to do so without being gassed, maced, and arrested. What's your perspective on that? What do you think about that?
I don't have a perspective.
The death of Michael Brown and other victims in similar cases sparked outrage across the U.S. over the last year. It also created a nationwide movement protesting police brutality against minorities.
And with me right now here in the studio is Dr. Udi Sommer, Associate Professor for Political Science at the Tel Aviv University. Good evening.
Good evening.
Until when? Until when we will see these demonstrations? Until when someone, because, okay, everybody's giving condemnations about what happened, everybody's saying that this is wrong, that something should be done, but something is not actually being done on the ground. Just talks and no action.
Well, there is some effort, but the problem of segregation is has very deep roots. Okay, so just to give you an idea, let's start with segregation in housing, for instance. Okay, the fact that there are certain neighborhoods which are predominantly African Americans and others that are predominantly white. So the St. Louis area is the top 10 most segregated cities in the United States, in cities where you have a large population of African Americans. How segregated it is? To make it less segregated, or to make it equal, you would have to relocate about 70% of African Americans and about 70% of white Americans.
Like to exchange?
To exchange and change people's houses.
So now let's think about it. Would the African American agree to move, and would the white Americans will agree to move to live next to an African American? Okay,
so there's various. So for instance, there's voucher systems, voucher programs that try to help or to make incentives for people to move. But we have to remember that moving or not moving also translates to many other things. It doesn't stop with housing. So for instance, if you live in a predominantly white neighborhood in this area, Ferguson and St. Louis, you have a life expectancy of 85 years. Okay, more or less. Your median income would be about $90,000 a year. Okay, if you move a mile and a half to the predominantly African American neighborhood, life expectancy would drop by about 15 years. Okay, which brings you much closer to certain Middle Eastern countries that we know. Okay, and we're not talking about Israel. Okay,
yes,
and the median income would drop by about 75%. Okay, so and this of course translates to education, right? If you live in an African American neighborhood, some of them you are likely to maybe make it to high school, maybe finish high school, but that's it. You're very unlikely to make it to college, and your social mobility would be stopped.
Dr. Zohar, we're in 2015. How come it's still happening? How come education or educating people against racism and not judging one another based on your color, how come this is not the first target that the United States is trying to reach right now?
Okay, so I mean, there's different levels, right? So there's the federal level, there's a state level, there's a local level. At least at the local level, there have been some attempts. So, for instance, the chief of police is now an African American. The chief of police in Ferguson is now an African American. The entire court system. So, one of the problems in Ferguson was the fact that African Americans were unproportionately likely to be fined based on things like traffic violations. Okay, and then the fines would cost them a lot of money. This would be a major source of income for the city. So now there's legislation that limits that and, for instance, would convert their fines to community work. So there's all sorts of attempts at the elite level. There's attempt at the grassroots level, right? We're aware of Black Lives Matter, right? That's one movement. Or Cop Watch, that's another movement. So those movements work, but these things are not going to happen overnight or even over a year. This is a project for years. This is probably the challenge of civil rights in America in our time.
Definitely. Professor Dr. Udi Sommer, thank you very, very much for this. And we're going